Welcome to this exciting roundtable on 5G growth goals, a turbo boost to commerce. We have a great lineup of illustrious panelists. If you would like to know more, please visit their speaker bios on the forum portal. Today, we are discussing one of the most important and exciting technologies that could redefine our communications, business landscape, and industries. 5G, the latest generation of wireless networks, promises super fast speed and much more stable connectivity that will enable a range of technologies from 3D social media and driverless cars to remote controlled manufacturing and robotics. Just like 4G brought us smartphones that changed our lives, 5G is set to bring us applications that will reshape our future way of living. Now, Jefferson and Jawad, we're still at the early stage of 5G development. What benefits are different countries already seeing as they adopt 5G?
I think you're bringing up a good point, Shirley, that it's definitely geography based. We're seeing a lot of fragmentation in terms of what benefits we're seeing. Certainly on the consumer side, we're starting to see some early actual revenue generation by moving up existing customers from kind of the lower price plans to the price that includes kind of some of the 5G benefits. So you're starting to see that instant migration as a control point on the price point. For the actual enterprise side of things, we're starting to see some new use cases pop up and helping them build out that weren't available before. So for example, working with video analytics on a low latency network like 5G to be able to work on worker safety and be able to kind of work through some of those examples where, if the worker doesn't have their protective helmet and their eye protection on, the machinery will not start. If heaven forbid they actually touch the machinery in the wrong way, how do we instantly cut off the power to that machine so there's no damage? So we're starting to see kind of use cases that actually weren't available before without 5G.
Good morning, thank you. And I'll focus a bit on the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region, the Arab world. We have the pioneering operators that have launched 5G in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the rest of the operators have a wait and see approach. They like to be on the lagging edge of technology for it to mature, prices to drop, especially as they cover middle income countries and lower income countries. On the GCC front, the main use case so far has been a substitute for fiber. So the low latency and very high speed of 5G has allowed operators with little fiber optic footprint to actually offer fiber-like services and compete with the operators that have a bigger fiber optic network in the country. That is now the primary use case of 5G. Basically, we've seen some adaptation of adjacent industries to that. For example, now TV stations that would like to have a live broadcast, they used to rely on satellites to that live broadcast event. However, if that event happens under a good coverage of 5G, they're actually switching to 5G. So now if the stadium has coverage of 5G, the live feed is actually happening on 5G networks, not on the satellite networks as before. So this is one extra example of the use of 5G, but all operators are still really eager to find more use cases and business models for their 5G network. There's always a lag between introducing a technology and the innovation that it unleashes, and we expect the same for 5G. One last point, 5G will remain a minority connectivity platform, connectivity model, connectivity technology, in the Middle East and North Africa. We don't expect it to be more than 8% of total connections by 2025, according to GSMA intelligence. And we still expect very strong growth in 4G connections alongside 5G connections. So that's the state now in the Arab world, the Middle East and North Africa.
Ernest, do you have any other use cases that you want to share?
Not really, but from the perspective of the Philippines, right, where we come from and where Pat comes from, we're the two leading telcos in the Philippines. The business case for us was really to bring about more capacity and more speed, higher speeds more often, right, to the public, as well as obviously a lower cost to produce on a per gig basis on 5G. The efficiency, spectral efficiency of the technology is something we look forward to. So given the fact that the country has a limited number of cell sites, owing to the past history of the country where it was very difficult to build cell sites, it's much easier now. With the new laws that were crafted, in the time of the pandemic, and now we're able to build. But then again, I think we're so far behind yet that it's going to take some time. And adding a new layer of technology on the same infrastructure and the same towers, I think, helps us offload 4G into 5G. But the challenge is majority of the consumer use cases today can really be done on 4G as of today, right? Obviously, we have the more esoteric ones. Someone mentioned gaming, low latency and stuff. I guess unless you're a specialist gamer, that extra latency boost is probably not going to be felt a whole lot. AR, VR for consumer, that's also been touted as a great 5G use case. But the lack of content, let alone the lack. I think today on our network, we have maybe 1% of the network only on 5G. And it's growing as fast, right? When people don't need to move up to 5G for no use case reason, then they will do it. In the Philippines, I always say that no handset gets thrown away in this country. It's always handed down, and that's why today both Smart and Globe, we operate 2G, 4, 5, and G. And hopefully we can kill one of these very shortly to improve our costs and reuse the spectrum, refarm it or something else. But that's just a reality in our country, right? People reuse it, hand it down, and it stays forever until it dies. I guess the battery goes first, and they plug it to the wall and keep it going. So, and I guess for the enterprise side, I mean, I appreciate everything what Jeff does. I see it, I read about it, but I still have to find an enterprise in the Philippines that's willing to try something like that. The quest to get people employed, I think, may deter a lot of these use cases also in the future. But I do reserve some optimism that edge computing is going to be a necessity at some point, because it does reduce cost of connectivity at some point. But then again, I think we're still a few years away from that happening.
Mysore and Manish, what are your observations in this?
Shirley, I want to pick up from two things that Ernest said. And by the way, it's always so good to see Ernest. I want to pick up from the optimism point he made. My memory serves me right. I want to go back and say when 3G phone was introduced by Apple, I don't think anybody, the advertising community, the marketing community at the time believed that their world will so dramatically change, right? In terms of digital marketing and media and how content will be consumed. The world changed around that time, and we continue to live and tell those stories 15 years hence. I believe that the 5G will probably be the campfire around which we will continue to tell a lot of great stories in times to come and many years to come. The reason I am saying that is because I believe 5G is not just going to spawn a world-class network. And by the way, I must take this moment and applaud the telecom network companies of the world for having allowed us to transform, operate so ubiquitously over the last 16 months of this crisis that the world has seen. I don't think many of us could have worked. Our kids could not have gone to school, studied, graduated. My niece graduated from our couch. Would not have happened without the telco industry. Keeping that optimism in mind and the fact that networks will evolve, but one more thing will evolve with that, and that is the process of innovation. We saw that with 4G. It kind of became the harbinger of new innovation, new use cases. So today the use cases may not be as apparent in the public 5G world, particularly in the consumer space, particularly in the emerging world. I completely agree. However, I think this process has just about begun, and 5G could lead to 6G for who knows, but I think the network evolution will continue to dominate our lives in terms of how we live, work, and play across industries, and of course in the consumer space. So I think there won't be any industry, whether it is healthcare or education, or whether it is manufacturing, or a public service, I think will continue to evolve. In the sporting world, I would say the first ball has just been delivered. I think we have a long way to go in this journey at this point.
Let me just add to
Thank
what I
you.
said. I just to extend what Manish said. Again, if you recall, though, we did say back when we were dialing up, what would we do with 10 Mbps? Right. So we're saying the same thing about 1 Gbps or 400 Mbps on a handset. I think one day someone out there will create another application that will require all of these infrastructure, because I think imagination of people and developers, especially disruptors, right? It may not come from our part of the world, but it could happen, right? Once this enabling technology is built as a platform, then the creativity will come up and create new applications.
I think that's such an important point you're mentioning, Ernest, because in 4G, there's an argument that necessarily the telcos weren't necessarily the ones that took advantage, right, of that innovation. So in 5G, we always get, in our industry, as you guys all know, every 10 years, we have a new chance to reposition ourselves in the value chain. And then in this times of 5G, how do we think about creating an innovation process, figuring out a position in the value chain so that we can take advantage of it, right? So it's not just simply as you had mentioned, an over-the-top player, an ISV that's getting all the actual market share or the dominance of this positioning, right? So, nothing against the examples that were given before of a Netflix, Airbnb, and Uber example in the 4G days, but how do we make sure that the CSP community, the telco community, is actually at a position of the value chain where we can take advantage of it, not at a megabyte level, but valued in that value chain where it's necessarily maybe you're extending your billing system and your billing relationship to an ISV, right? An independent software provider that's developing on top of your network. Or maybe it's actually using your analytics of your customer care solution and extending that to a large company that's trying to go over the top of the network so that you're materially a part of that value chain. I think that's something really important right now that we got to make sure that as we move into this 5G, how do we reposition the CSPs into that part of the value chain?
Yeah, I think.
Actually, if I had to butt in, I see this whole 5G to be in two different directions. That's how one around taking the connectivity deeper. That's how we take it. So basically, which enables a complete ecosystem of applications, the services riding on it, or the scale benefit, or the productivity enhancement. So around that is the one where the 5G itself would play a significant role in taking it much deeper. Then very closely associated to that is the overall socio-economic benefits itself, which I will talk about it when I touch upon some of the use cases, especially around healthcare, around the education, which Manish touched upon it. Without these telcos, this could never have happened, especially in education as one of the sector, or the way the whole pollution has been there. How could you be, and the public safety and the driver safety, all of them. So this broadly, it classified across one under the connectivity, which is any connectivity player would be focusing on, and the other is for socio-economic benefits. If I just have to dwell a little bit around use cases, we have been working on, we being a digital ecosystem enablement player, basically we have been working on one of the automobile. We call it as a car in research to a car in on the road. So basically research to road. That's the stitching we are able to do with this. And of course, the 5G itself would enhance the complete various use cases which comes into it. As a move platform, we call it as a V2X, vehicle to everything or anything. We should be in a position to connect it, be it a driver's infotainment or driver's the vehicle's telematics data, how it runs. So across the ecosystem, or for an OEM who is this is more at automobile sector, how does he upgrade or how does he manage the upgrades or the whole maintenance of the vehicle, and hence the whole communication ecosystem, how it works on. Very interesting case study. With 5G, this definitely should enhance much bigger, because as we speak, the more prevalent is your 3G and 4G, but 5G should open out quite a lot of use cases around, especially around over-the-air updates or the upgrades for a car. Of course, there are quite a lot of policies which needs to be written around what would get upgraded when, under park condition or under a movement condition, and all of them. But still, the use cases which it is going to develop around, just in the case of automobile sector, is very interesting. In fact, as we speak, we are feeling the need of it, at the same time the benefits of it as such. I just thought that I heard Jefferson and Jawad talking about the private 5G itself, how it is getting integrated into a larger 5G, the public 5G itself. Actually, I think it would be more use case driven or use case oriented, which itself should be developing more and more as we look at it.
That's an excellent point you made, Madhu. I think because one of the study Nokia and Commission was to look at how many private networks we would need over the course of next 10 years. Because one of the transformational aspects that we look at 5G is that we have built wide area networks, and we have been talking, Ernest and Kat, about obviously the consumer side of the challenges. Of course, you have to build the wide area networks for enhanced mobile broadband connectivity, higher capacity. And if you look at the total number of base stations today that we have built globally, the number is 7 million. Well, when we start to digitize the physical world, these manufacturing sites, these logistics, ports, you name it, warehouses, you need almost twice the number. So we have looked at the number in terms of 14 million sites and 14 million of those local area networks that have to be built over the course of next 10 years. So we take a very transformative view in terms of the potential of 5G. While I'm very cognizant of the different maturation of the different markets, what we have to also keep in mind from our perspective is how the landscape is changing, because what COVID has done is shown us the catalytic effect, because we've invested in the sectors in the past which allowed us to pivot. I think to Manish's point, we were able to do education, telehealth, all of those things. But the contribution from industries to our GDP, which are all the physical industries, we hardly put in the investments in ICT, and 5G becomes the catalytic force of that. So as we get into open ecosystems, edge cloud constructs, you would start to see a number of more players playing in the market, because clearly telco industry is leading the way. They're making these investments, they're looking for return on investments. In many cases, they are figuring out what is the monetization schema. They are spinning off their non-core assets. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the fact that web scale companies are aggressively and boldly moving into local turfs, putting in their edge cloud instances. Tower companies thinking about 5G and edge clouds, enterprise industrials building their own private networks because of these mission critical, higher SLA performance needs. And then application providers. I think, Madhu, you mentioned about exposing the power of the network, and that is becoming a really important point, because no application provider can reasonably process and program the underlying networking capabilities of the 5G network. So what we are seeing is the promise of 5G it will start to offer itself as a platform and offer itself as a service going forward, which means the number of these application providers, whether it's coming from enterprise manufacturing and others, can now take the power of the underlying networking capabilities and expose that. So we can get into a lot of these discussions, because while we are working on the consumer side of the things, we in our own Nokia case have ventured out on transforming our own factory operation. And what will be very interesting for the audience to know that while we have built edge clouds and 5G private networks, what we have been able to do is to implement extreme robotics automation. We implemented safety controls. For example, if a forklift has to work in proximity to a human, it has to work at a safe speed. If the human is not around, it can work 3x the speed. So you can see the productivity improvements. We were able to remotely work, diagnose, control, assemble, manipulate any task remotely. We were able to do cloud testing. meaning any product anywhere can be assembled and manufactured. And what it resulted in is a very economic implication. 30% year-over-year productivity that we have seen in our sites, 80% improvement in lead times in terms of production facilities, and 20% reduction in safety incidents. So you can see that by looking at a transformational impact on the enterprise side, you can improve safety, productivity, and efficiency of some of these industries. So the last point before I wrap up on this segment is that I encourage even the emerging nations to not look at 5G as just something near term I need to fix. And that's where the government and the policymakers have to help the industry, because it is a time of equalization, because the technology is very distributed. It will be local. It will be software centric. So if you start to think about what sectors matter to me in my local economy, you better start building those or injecting the fuel and the injection of capital to build those intelligent 5G private networks that can then work hand in hand with the public network to drive economic productivity enhancements. So that's the perspective that we hold.
Yeah, I think I just want everybody to take a step back, and I want to circle back to Manish, who acknowledged the role that the telcos played during the pandemic. I've been in this industry for quite a long time, a number of decades, and it was just during the last few months that the telcos again became front and center. Ernest and us at PLDT, we understood and we continue to understand the pressure and the responsibility that we have on our shoulders. But nevertheless, we're taking that forward. Now, I think Jeff also brought up a good point when he did mention that 4G was a play of the OTTs. I think that is a fair point. And you also mentioned that maybe the telcos were not able to capitalize as much on 4G. I saw that happening as well. And yes, that was when the OTT world came and there was a lot of brickbatting. 5G, I know it's going to be tough. There are other priorities that we have today. As Ernest did mention, the use case that we're seeing is really on low latency gaming. But nevertheless, we remain to be excited. We want to be able to see a world, right, where there are smart cities. And we have tried to start. There are some POCs that we are rolling out as we speak, primarily in the areas of agriculture. This is an industry that we also want to support moving forward. We all have seen throughout the pandemic how important just being able to feed ourselves is. Education, of course, as well as commerce, and I guess healthcare. The thing, though, is that our business models, our financial sheets are all about, how well we can optimize the capex that we spend on the network. And we will have to innovate if the world is looking at the telco to bring 5G forward. We will definitely need partners because, as we know, 5G is an ecosystem. It is not a pipe, right? For the longest time, telcos have been piped. So it's good that we get acknowledgement from the floor on the role that we play. But guys, we need everybody's help to make it happen.
Kat, I am.
Somebody's got to talk about the financing side because that's what we're struggling with. We can't everything earnest.
Kat, here is my take on it. I think we need to change the narrative. I believe that some people have sold a pipe dream to the telcos at some point that we can be what we don't have to be. And maybe some of us are the culprits there. That let's digitize, let's try and build products, but you don't have to build. I remember this meeting with Ernest many months ago, where he did say that, hey, connectivity and providing the best possible connectivity and great service to my customers is a great priority. I think it's a brilliant priority. And I think, Fahd used a great word. I like that. Exposing the power of the network is a responsibility. Is a phenomenal, massive responsibility. And I believe the last 18 months have proven beyond doubt. I asked many of you during the last 1 year, the fact that you allowed these networks to run so effortlessly, was it an accident or was it meticulous planning in the past? Right? Obviously, it's a rhetorical question. It was no accident. It was a collective effort by all of you and many other people to make it happen. So I think the world will have to recognize, and you made some tremendous points about the other industries, which will now suddenly become more fashionable. And the emerging world has a role to play. Education, workforce, mobilization. You said that in your pre-talk. Healthcare, remote healthcare particularly. We have seen what just happened in India and what could have happened, what could have been averted. Clearly the need to feed the people across the world, 7.5 billion people, I think is a brilliant industry and opportunity that networks of the world can solve. I think collaboration rather than building your own product, enabling rather than owning, I think is, to changing that narrative, I think is important. I had said this earlier as well, that maybe CSP is a wrong word for your industry. Mm-hmm. You are probably a PSP, you are a platform service provider, you enabled, why are we not giving you enough marks for what happened in 4G? We don't believe that the value was eroded. Yeah, somebody else made a lot more value on the network, no doubt. But I don't think your value has got eroded. I think if anything, I think the value has just got enhanced beyond anybody's doubt in my mind. I think this is the industry that will continue to drive the future of humanity and industry both.
Manish, you make an excellent point, because for the longest time, the value creation and value capture has been out of whack. And that has been a bit of a problem in our industry. And I think, Jeff, you made a good point in the 5G era, because application devices, edge clouds, and networks are all coming together and they are residing at the edge. It sort of changed the equation a little bit. So if you start to platformize this network and expose that power, you can sort of look at monetization differently. But I would like to call the CSPs, in my humble view, the value brokers of the future. Because imagine if the example I'm giving you, and we've seen that, if you can help your industry, manufacturing, for example, do 30% productivity growth, you can enable that through the power of your edge clouds and private networks. What is stopping you to get into a business model discussion that I am entitled to X percentage of that in return, right? So there's a basically a risk and reward sharing, because from a business model and trend perspective, the point that you made, Kat, is we have to move away from this notion of capex and upfront investments and buying and all the time, because we have to look at outcome basis. That's what Nokia believes, that we have to be moving into this world basically as a service, on demand, outcome basis, because these enterprises and industrials work on a basis of business service level agreements. So we were working with a port operator who wants to have 24/7 crane operation as they start to load cargo from ships. And so how do you maintain a 24/7 precision control for the machinery that's operating in a port control? So if you are to offering these kind of services, you're no longer selling subscription bundles in the future to consumers, but you're now selling SLAs. And so if outcomes can be driven into value, the value has to be fed back. So we are at a prime point to start collectively thinking about cooperation models between different industry players, because it's not just the telcos, we all have to act together to try and drive this towards this new value paradigm.
Very right, actually, Manish, I pick up your point. Sometime back, we changed our name itself, Digital Ecosystem Enablement Player. So I just like that word. Just a little bit talking about industrial context, what you mentioned. Probably earlier, if any telco player would have gone, they would have just been happy with giving some connectivity to that large manufacturing unit, and then would have been happy with that. Actually, we devised a concept called man, machine, and material. Basically, that's if you just say that everything is, we call it as a connected things, from man to machine, machine to material. So basically, touching across safety and how the complete the security of various employees who work in a manufacturing environment. Then the productivity, how it is being looked at, especially looking at the various equipments, and then the big machineries which are there in that. And then, of course, the logistics of how the material movement. This actually, today, some of the use cases you are able to do with 3Gs and 4Gs, what we have to, and some places even Wi-Fi as well. But actually, as the 5G, private 5G itself is coming into the fore, I can tell you the number of use cases which is going to be there around just this concept, Industry 4.0, cutting across the connected things, which we call it. That's going to be humongous. In fact, it was quite, I couldn't resist saying this particular manufacturing related use cases, what we started looking at it as.
Mm-hmm. What was the third one? You said man, machine, and?
Man, machine, and material.
Material. That's very nice, actually. I like it.
And if you allow me one reminder here, we're still not in the 5G era. Most of the world still lives in areas not covered by 5G. And this is where it's very important for policymakers and governments to think completely differently from the 3G and 4G era. For example, spectrum pricing. If governments think that they can get the same per megahertz pricing for spectrum for 5G that they got for 3G or 4G, then no networks will be built. We also have to think about technology neutrality, flexibility of operators to switch off networks and refarm their spectrum for 4G and or 5G, and of course also longer spectrum licenses. So the duration ideally should be more than 20 years, 25 years, with an implicit understanding that it is renewable rather than completely going back to zero. So when the spectrum needs for a very reliable 5G networks, as we all know, is around 20 megahertz in the sub-1 gigahertz, around 100 megahertz in the C-band, and almost 1 gigahertz in the millimeter wave. This has to also, governments have to look at making sure that this spectrum is available for a competitive market space to unleash innovation. So we're still not there. Basically, if you look at the world, we're still not in the 5G era when it comes to people covered and population covered by 5G networks.
So Jawad, you're saying that basically there really needs to be a lot of change and innovation around three things, right? Policy, business model for the private sector, I guess, and then lastly is really your skills, so your talent. But I guess if I could just ask the floor, where do we start?
Because all fronts. You start on all fronts.
I think, Kat, you make a good point. Look, there are three things really. The business model innovation is a very central piece, and I think the collective the ecosystem has to think through value creation and value capture from that perspective, and then of course the service and use cases comes in. Corresponding to that, you need to really think about what is the minimal viable product that I need to drive towards this 5G evolution, right? Yes, but at the same time, as you're working on your MVP configuration, you need to look at what the future network architecture looks like so that the investments that you want to make are future-proof. So you don't want to make ad hoc investments, and so you need to look at that. And then finally, you need to time the transformation, because in our experience, as we look at the transformation of different CSPs towards 5G, there is a direct implication of the timing and the different decisions on the cost per gigabit that they can actually achieve based on when they implement certain things and how they automate their operations, etc. So those three things have to be worked in concert. And one other thing, I think organizationally, it's very important in many organizations is that we have to be evangelists of what the technology can do. Sometimes the CTOs are working on things and the product and the marketing and business people might not be fully aware of the promise of what this technology can do. So you need to drive an integrated marketing and product strategy as well. And those are the kind of things that I think comes top of mind for me.
I think a good way to kind of describe it, you know, when you mention that, Kennery, is really what's the order, right? It's incredibly important that you're asking. I think policy is really the first one we have to start with, right? If we're not freeing up enough sub-6 globally, and we're not building up enough of an ecosystem, because what we have to think about is while the network is being developed, we still need to actually have enough modems to be able to, you know, receive. We still have to have devices that may not be smartphones be developed, and that takes time. So if we aren't having kind of policy push this first on freeing up spectrum, the rest of the actual value chain doesn't follow. That's part one. I think the next part that you bring up is super interesting because there's a lot there. We talked about this word platform and this transition to platform, but that takes an entirely different mentality right? In today's world, we're very used to monetizing a megabyte. We're very used to monetizing a transaction. And if we're going to move to a platform economy is very different. A platform is driving engagement to create monetization opportunities. And that requires an entirely different way of thinking and a new business model. Now, when you move to a platform economy and you find your position in the value chain, it's really important to define what those control points are. Because in a platform economy, you have to figure out what your control points are. Is your control point data? Is your control point an SLA, like someone brought up before? Is your control point, the relationship with the customer? Where are those control points in a platform economy? And then realizing that business model is engagement. And there's times we will have to give things, like we may have to give control of something we're not used to. And that is part of the network, right? Exposing your biggest investment, which is your network, is not a fundamentally easy thing. Opening up an API, people spend millions and millions of dollars on making an API and exposing it. So, I mean, look at Twilio, look at these platform economies that are exposing APIs, how difficult that is. And then once you actually move to that, what other technologies can you enable? But I would challenge everybody, and I would say that the platform economy is the right way to go. There's a lot to do around it, but there's a big piece around you have to add energy into any flywheel. So in any platform, to be able to say, we're going to build this and we're going to hope everybody comes to it, is going to be a difficult situation. If there isn't some lighthouse, some energy, some lead service that's pushed in to the actual ecosystem, it won't start to turn. The wheels will not turn. The flywheel will not go automatically. So, I would challenge, what is the lead service for the right segments? What is the lead service for the right industries? Because each one of those may require the leadership of this group to be able to do that, and then allow those control points to take over so that the platform can roll. So I think there's a way to build these, and it's important to kind of keep those in mind.
Yeah. Very right. Jefferson and Jawad, I think you used the spectrum itself. Now, I would add probably a point additional to it, basically the rationalization of the spectrum, because every country has got its own as looking at the way they look at the spectrum needs to be allocated. It has a very severe cascading impact on how the rest of the ecosystem going up to the device itself has got a huge impact on that, because this is one thing I think it is very critical, because some people are talking about sub-6, some people are talking about millimeter wave, and so on and so forth. And then there is enough bandwidth has not been looked at. I'm looking at a much larger context to this. It's a very critical point for 5G itself to be the adoption to get much, much faster than what we have been able to achieve as so far.
So these are really interesting takes on the potential of 5G and how governments and countries can support the development of 5G and how the industry can work together. So, the adoption of 5G really came almost at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. How does the pandemic impact the development and utilization of 5G? And what has been the biggest accomplishments in the 5G development over the past years? Perhaps for you.
I think I see that it has had a very accelerated and catalytic effect on the adoption curve of 5G itself, because in one of the studies that we did was when we looked at what we call digital mature industries and physical industries. Digital mature industries meaning finance, media, others. Over the course pre-pandemic, they have received 70% of total ICT investments that has been made. And the segment which represents 70% of our world GDP and employs 75% of the workforce, all these manufacturing, mining, agriculture, transportation, government, they received only 30% of the ICT. When pandemic came, we saw that there was a big gap that was exposed. In the United States alone, if you see what has happened is in those industries which had invested in these digitalization efforts and have gone towards 4G and 5G adoption, they were very easily able to pivot. Look at what happened to retail sales in the United States. The first 3 months of the pandemic, the numbers were astronomical. What happened in 3 months didn't happen in the last 10 years. Telehealth, everybody was the same. But look at what happened on the manufacturing side. In the early days, when the personal protection equipment and ventilators and masks were required, the manufacturers were not able to easily pivot because they didn't have the capacity or the capability to do adaptive manufacturing. And since then, you're seeing a lot of adoption of these edge-enabled private 5G networks, doing 3D technologies to try to drive adaptive manufacturing. Now, these manufacturing setups can easily now adapt itself to be able to drive towards new product design, drive any product at any locations. And that is the sort of trend that we are seeing in trying to drive more productivity and more resiliency in some of these industries going forward. So what we see happening is the next 10 years is that this sector, which has had reduced ICT or 5G enabled spend, will see a lot of investments happening over the course of the next 10 years. Well, one last point, that although this has been a catalytic effect, the COVID itself, we also have another catalytic effect, which is the open standards. There's a lot of discussion around the value of openness, which has also brought in a lot of new players in the ecosystem that has allowed us to do things at different speed, different economics. The time to market is changing. And then also these industries that we talk about, for the first time, they're running these operations technology systems, which are closed loop systems with very high reliability, 6-9 reliability. And for the first time, 5G is colliding with that. So the IT and OT is colliding and opening up this space for them to start to use the general purpose nature. So you see all of these catalytic effects, the edge, the open ecosystems, the adoption driven through COVID is actually pivoting all of these industries to make very proactive plans in how the adoption curve will happen. So we see a lot of that momentum picking up beyond the consumer space as well into enterprise and industrials.
Look, Shirley, I don't think 5G is an event. I think it is one of the milestones in a long journey of this evolution. This journey began a few decades ago with the wireless technology, and I think we are somewhere in that journey right now. To call the pandemic anything but the pandemic, I think would be blasphemous in my mind. It has really caused so much havoc. However, I think I like the word catalytic. It has compelled the world to try and look at the things very differently. If I was given 2 minutes of a job by either Kat or Ernest to become the marketing representative for the industry, I would really put this worldwide global ad and said, we, the industry, kept you kicking and going and connected and moving. I think that is what the industry has done. And that is why 5G or 6G or doesn't matter what, I think this process has gotten a new leash of life. The process of connectivity and the industry, I think, is a brilliant opportunity going forward here on. Everything that everyone has said is important. I do believe we need to keep things simple, though. I don't think we need to be, each of us have a role to play. I don't think we need to complicate the world more for the industry, for example, to try and emulate what we are not. That, I think, is a lesson from 4G. So while the 5G network spread and deployment may have gotten a little slowed down because of the pandemic in the initial months, it did speed up, to Fahad's point, eventually. And I think it is gaining tremendous speed right now. But I think there is more to be done. The point that Jefferson made about policy in response to Kat's question, I agree with that. We live in a world where the kids don't want to buy houses, buy cars. Why should the service providers pay tons of money for acquiring the spectrum? Maybe it should be a post-paid model rather than a prepaid model. A consumption-based model in industry that we live in, maybe something like that. But I think there is a business model and a need by the government and policymakers to incentivize the industry to bring these networks, because we have now seen in the last 15 months that the networks can make economies, can make education, healthcare, everything keep ticking.
That's a lovely conclusion for this panel, Manish. And we have come a long journey to reach 5G, and in the next few years, we'll see more potential coming out of it. And even, for the next generations of networks like 6G and others. So, unfortunately, we're nearing the end of today's discussion. I'd like to thank the panelists for their great takes on this topic, and thank you all very much for joining this session. Please enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.